So this session, we have Ed Stratford here who will be our discussant, and we'll just introduce each paper individually. First we have Rachel LaForce, Creating and Maintaining a Sense of Place Through Guernsey's Housing Control Law, Balancing Traditional Regulations and Contemporary Neoliberalism. And I suppose just a quick note, one thing we've tried to do here is actually integrate sociocultural and archaeological papers so that we get a good cross-subdisciplinary dialogue, I suppose. So, Rachel.
Current anthropological theory is constantly enforcing the idea that neoliberalism is bad. As a general definition, neoliberalism is a kind of market reform wherein governments deregulate, decreasing their roles in citizens' lives. The services previously offered by the government agencies are then controlled by private corporations driven by profits. We are surrounded by inflamed articles such as one anthropologist who characterized neoliberalism as the latest in a dishonorable history of strategies of depoliticization of politics. Anthropologists further blame neoliberalism for the disappearance of native economic systems, as well as assisting the wealthy in increasing their fortunes by making money off of middle and lower class citizens. My research argues that they're wrong. My ethnographic research of Guernsey's two-tiered housing market proves that neoliberalism, when balanced with the traditional markets that already exist, can contribute to the culture that is already in place, even assisting in the preservation of that culture. My findings closely follow the work of Charles Knuckles, who suggests that extreme positions are productive when they exist in unrelieved tension with their opposites. This opposition is what contributes to the sense of place that Edward Casey defines as affiliated historical, social, and political aspects, the felt density of a particular place, and the sense that it has something lasting in it. The density that Casey identifies is what Guernsey residents are maintaining as they find equilibrium between two seemingly opposed sides, represented by traditional regulations and contemporary neoliberalism. To give some background, Guernsey is an island off the southeastern coast of England. It is 24 square miles and home to approximately 65,000 residents. It has all the modern technological advancements, as well as traditional features of the English countryside. It is a British Crown dependency, meaning that it is part of the British Empire, but it has its own parliamentary system separate from Westminster. The Housing Control Law of 1948 established the two-tiered housing market that I referred to earlier, placing strict controls on who can move there, how long they can stay, and where they can live within the island. My fieldwork consisted of 2 months in Guernsey, where I attended community meetings and government debates on housing issues, and interviewed residents about their opinion of the purpose and effectiveness of the Housing Control Law. The first section that I will discuss is called the local market. It has approximately 25,000 properties, which range in price from $400,000 to $1 million. Only native-born residents and those who receive essential housing licenses from the local government can live in these properties. This local market represents the traditional regulations that Guernsey established before the introduction of the free market system. This traditionalism includes nuanced legislation that attempts to consider every possibility. One example of its comprehensive structure is the development of the housing license. Guernsey does not produce enough professionals in many essential jobs, such as nurses and teachers. However, the high prices of the open market deter non-natives from moving to Guernsey and filling those positions. As an economic incentive for individuals to do so, the government can issue an essential housing license to a company for a specific job opening, allowing whomever the company hires for that position to live on the less expensive local market. To further complicate the system, the essential housing license will be issued in regards to the employer's family size and income, citing a minimum size or price for the property they live in within the local market. In the words of an essential license holder that I interviewed, they have tick boxes like everything else, so instead of taking people at face value, it's whether you meet the criteria in the tick box. If you don't fit neatly into one of their boxes, then it's a bit more complicated. The second section of the two-tiered housing market is called the open market. It has approximately 1,700 properties with prices starting at $1 million. Price is the only limitation on residents of the open market. Anyone who can afford the properties can live there. Open market residents are not brought to the island for a specific job. They will have to find a job on their own, but all open market residents receive a right to work document. This kind of blanket control demonstrates a key characteristic of neoliberalism. This concrete legislation allows open market residents to avoid the bureaucratic red tape that frustrated most local market residents I interviewed. The open market recognizes the economic benefits that wealthy individuals can offer Guernsey, bringing prosperity through participation in the local economy. In addition to these concrete financial benefits, they bring the professional expertise they have in their own fields. This expertise can be a huge boon to Guernsey, especially in modern fields where native islanders haven't upskilled to the same level as available on the mainland. The housing control law has evolved according to the necessities of the community. Margaret Rodman explains this evolution in the sense that a single physical landscape can be multilocal in the sense that it shapes and expresses polysemic meanings of place for different users. The need for various markets becomes more obvious when looking at their distinct details and the different classes of residents that interact with them. The stereotypical socioeconomic differences between these two groups, local and open market residents, suggest that they are likely experiencing a very different place. These residents live in Guernsey for different reasons and are accordingly doing exactly what Rodman states, experiencing the same place quite differently. Knuckles addresses the negative emotions associated with these markets, the residents, and the strife between the two when he writes that no paradox could inspire such feelings unless it were founded on a deeply felt and perhaps defensive need. Knuckles offers that these paradoxical emotions are an indication rather than a result of the relationship between both groups, meaning that the two-tiered housing market is an indication of the deeper separation between Guernsey's residents. Knuckles continues his hypothesis to say that opposing groups can resolve this discomfort by assigning values formally instead of relying on their initial uneasiness. When applied in Guernsey, it offers an explanation for the seeming goodwill between the two markets. This two-tiered housing market demonstrates that neoliberal policies are not instituted for their own sake. As residents taught me in field interviews, both the neoliberal and traditional sections of the market are evenly yoked to provide the tension amongst the collective group of Guernsey's residents. Culture is about more than just common consensus amongst a group of people. Culture is infinitely more complicated and is supplied by the various relationships that are placed at odds with each other. Knuckles suggests that such systems are made up of goals that cannot be reached. These goals are unachievable because of the paradox present in their systems. This continued striving towards an end, although it will never be reached, allows the culture to continue recalibrating to new needs, finding temporary solutions. Individuals must navigate these opposing paradigms while developing and remaining true to their collective belief systems and practices. The role of each housing group demonstrates the benefits and consequences that housing group has to offer Guernsey. Although the states could implement a free market system wherein all properties are available to all citizens, doing so would eliminate the social roles that provide a variety of outcomes. Uniting all citizens within a free market is viewed as a lesser priority than the state's ability to control who is living within Guernsey's borders and the social and economic benefits they bring with them. In this context, the recent anthropological critiques of neoliberalism appear misplaced, as they turn a blind eye against the valuable role it provides in distinguishing one resident from another. While their arguments for the negative effects of neoliberalism may be true, they fail to take into account the benefits it provides. Finally, Knuckles defines a paradox, the paradox present in Guernsey's housing market, as an idea involving two opposing thoughts that, however contradictory, are equally necessary. This proves true in Guernsey's housing market, as each tier contributes its unique benefits and consequences to the complete picture of what Guernsey has to offer its residents. Combining the seemingly opposed systems presents a more genuine look at what is truly Guernsey, allowing Guernsey's residents allowing Guernsey's culture to be preserved more wholly as it moves into the future. Knuckles articulates this positive dependence, saying that the elements that stand in contrast to each other simultaneously call each other into being and depend on each other for the dynamic they together constitute. Guernsey would be different if it lacked either the local or the open market, and each of these markets would be different without the other. In conclusion, Guernsey would not be the same if the two-tiered housing market did not exist. The equilibrium that is created between the open and local markets is one factor in the one-of-a-kind attitude that is purported by residents and foreigners alike. This understanding of how legislation can assist in the creation and maintenance of a sense of place provides a precedent for further government action and advises against eliminating the presence of opposing points of view from a given community. Such opposition plays a valuable role that cannot be replaced. Thank you.
So just to start off real quick, I'm going to define polygyny as the marriage of one man to several women. Polygamy is kind of the umbrella term that we use to talk about polygyny and polyandry, which is one woman married to several men. So the aim of this study is basically to demonstrate the co-constitution or inextricable nature of collectivism and individualism in some of these women's experiences that I studied in order to improve the way that we address collectivism in a marriage and family therapy setting. To give some quick definitions before I get into my argument, collectivism is currently defined in the social sciences. This is a definition by social psychologist Myers, as giving priority to the goals of one's group and defining one's identity accordingly. We usually think of China when we think of collectivism, other Eastern nations. And then individualism is the concept of giving priority to one's own goals over group goals and defining one's identity in terms of personal attributes rather than group identifications. America is kind of the poster child for this concept. So we've all heard of these jokes about in-laws and extended family, and it's a big part of our American culture, you could say. And it's kind of become a light-mannered way of representing some of the legitimate struggles that many married couples deal with. As I read these phrases, think about some of the ways you might have seen instances of these in your own or others' lives. Parents' interference in choice of spouse, the concept of marrying two families together as opposed to two individuals, and conflict due to problems with in-laws. These problems inevitably enter many marriage and family therapy sessions in America, but these particular struggles come directly from research conducted by Dept et al. 2013 that evaluates cultural issues which family therapists must be aware of in working with Asian, Indian American, or collectivist clients. While these issues may indeed be more prevalent in a collectivist labeled culture, current therapeutic research reflects a trend in attributing certain patterns to the belonging of an individual either to a predominantly individualist or collectivist culture. If client A comes from a collectivist culture, then we make assumptions A, B, and C, and explore issues X, Y, and Z with them. While literature does acknowledge the coexistence of elements of collectivism and individualism within a single culture, there remains a quite strict divide in the concept of these two constructs and their implications in marriage and family therapy. This divide is evident in the way that we talk about and address the perception of Western and non-Western differences. Dept also states, in contrast to Western psychology, which focuses on the individualism, cognitive processing, and material reinforcements, these native healers focus on strict social sanctions. Here, Dept demonstrates the commonly perceived duality of collectivism and individualism by stating that Western scholars focus on the individualist and Eastern healers on the collective. Similarly, the focus of marriage and family literature more often adopts a lens viewing the treatment of collectivism as opposed to the opposite construct of individualism. So my concern is that in setting therapeutic efforts on addressing the collectivist elements of a given culture, the literature and practices surrounding cross-cultural marriage and family therapy tend to omit critical influences in an individual's life that we would typically label individualist. In doing so, we essentially impose a collectivist model onto the client's experiences. And Hmong people, tied to Chinese roots, fall into such a camp of collectivism and are thus more prone to some of these impositions when seeking help in the United States and for marital and family conflict. So to give a brief background on Hmong people, Hmong are a nationless, semi-nomadic Southeast Asian ethnic minority that originated in southern China. Throughout centuries of Chinese persecution, Hmong migrated into the mountainous regions of China and Southeast Asia and are now one of several commonly known hill tribes of Southeast Asia. Many have moved down out of mountainous regions in Southeast Asia and become largely incorporated into the nation states which they reside, primarily Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. The global dispersal of Hmong refugees after the Vietnam War also led to a high concentration of Hmong people, refugees and immigrants in California, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So Hmong are traditionally patrilineal in that they pass down the ancestral rights through the male line. Polygyny is a fairly common practice in Hmong culture, and the frequency of the practice itself seems to be diminishing slightly, possibly due to a migration of Hmong out of mountainous regions and into a more urban setting, where they've become more integrated into Thai society, in this case, in the village where I spent time. So for 2.5 months, I lived in a Hmong village in northern Thailand, conducting research on gender role perception and polygynous marriages, using a mixture of participant observation and semi-structured interviews. And in these interviews with my 3 case studies, we focused on background, on their marital background, decisions involving commitment and divorce, how their children have been or would be affected by marital status, and ritual practices. Upon returning from fieldwork, I used qualitative data analysis software to draw out the most common or potent factors influencing these women to commit to their marriages. So each case study was in a drastically different situation than the others. One was divorced, one was separated, and one was cohabiting with the husband and second wife. And yet each remained committed to her marriage, primarily for reasons involving ancestral rituals, their children's relationships to their clans, and beliefs concerning personal responsibility, which I refer to as karma in my paper. I will call these the 3 domains of co-constitution between individualism and collectivism. So these underlying decision-making factors illustrate the embedded nature of collectivist reasoning and individualist reasoning, in effect creating a co-occurring pattern of decision-making in which one construct is inevitably tied to the other. And for time's sake, I will talk about just one of these domains of co-constitution, that which involves ancestral worship and rituals. So in terms of what we might consider the more collectivist concerns, one of the most important relationships in Confucianism in Chinese culture and closely tied to Hmong culture is the importance of the father-son relationship, which indicates the importance of passing down the correct ancestral rights that are specific to your clan. So this is a quote from a case study who I'll call Iya, who lives in a separate hut from her husband to provide distance from an abusive relationship, and who has decided not to leave her husband. She says, "If I was just learning to do rituals, then my sons could learn it from anyone and anywhere. They could learn it from the relatives. But each clan of Hmong people performs their rituals differently from one another. So if I was to take my sons back to my relatives, they could not become part of my side of the family's clan and would eventually have to come back and be part of the husband's clan." So here she points out the importance of passing down, of sons being connected to their fathers, because they must learn the word-for-word ancestral rights for their ancestors. Otherwise, the ancestors could not bless the living, and the flow of blessings between the living and the dead would be interrupted. In Hmong tradition, a woman can go back to her biological clan if they have grounds to demand compensation for the way their daughter was treated. Otherwise, there's not really any returning to a woman's clan, original clan. She will always be part of her husband's clan. In this case, Iya could technically have returned and her family could have demanded compensation, but this would mean disservicing the ancestors because of divorce and disruption in ritual practice. Her children cannot be part of her biological clan because through the patriline they belong to the husband's clan. She stays committed to her husband in devotion to the ancestors and the living. Now, in terms of what we might call more individualistic factors, there are daily rituals that anyone can do themselves, but certain rituals require the patriarchal leader or a shaman. Through regular divorce, Iya would have the option to separate from her husband's clan and leave the children with him to avoid the dilemma of taking her sons away from him. But here, ritual isolation becomes a massive dilemma because Iya would have to pay shamans to do rituals for her, which can be quite pricey depending on the ritual. And without monetary support from clan members, she would be on her own, providing for herself and without means to spiritual support. There's also a lower level of willingness to provide help or service to divorcees or widows because of the attached stigma in these situations to divorcees and widows. So this is a quote from a different case study's daughter-in-law. She says, "But they say that if it's just the woman that goes to ask and not the man, then it's as if there's not as much respect or weight behind the asking for it, not much worth. So perhaps they might not come even if it's just a small ritual. Or perhaps they might think that it's a single woman, so I don't want to go there. People might say things or make assumptions. Or they might also think it's just a woman, we don't need to go. So this is illustrative of the avoidance of spiritual isolation and suffering from social stigma attached to being a divorcee, an extremely individual concern. And we can see the embedded nature of this individualist reasoning in the collective, because in not providing for the ancestors, she inhibits her own chances for prosperity. If she were to leave her husband, she would disservice the ancestors, and they would in turn not be able to bless her. In this case, it is impossible to separate individual concerns from collective concerns. So in conclusion, I just want to say that an awareness of individualism and collectivism and the differences between them is necessary, but so is the distinction between awareness and imposition of these cultural constructs. My concern is that when training for and writing about cross-cultural therapy, as a Western culture, we focus on the collectivist aspect in a far outweighing manner and don't pay attention to what we would typically label individualist concerns within the same culture. So some solutions would be to restructure cross-cultural therapeutic training in terms of thinking about individualism and collectivism, and to carefully consider the ways in which we teach and write about these constructs and their underlying implications. Thank you.
In my research, I investigated historic accounts about Navajo, Apache, Ute, and Shoshone death practices to find a possible correlation with Fremont burn structures. Burn structures are commonly found at Fremont archaeological sites. The Fremont lived in subterranean, earthen-covered structures called pit houses. The Fremont lived in Utah from about 400 to 1300 AD. I will be discussing burned structures at Wolf Village and Five Finger Ridge. Then I will talk about house burials at Five Finger Ridge and at sites located along the Dolores River. I do this because Navajo and Shoshone also sometimes buried their dead in houses. Finally, I will discuss Navajo, Apache, Ute, and Shoshone practices and beliefs about death. Wolf Village is a Fremont site located in Goshen, Utah. Brigham Young University has conducted its archaeological field school there from 2009 to 2013. 9 structures have been excavated. 6 of the 9 structures were burned. 5 of the structures had burned beams lying on their floor or in the floor zone. Structure 3, 5, and 7 had few or no artifacts on their floors. Structure 2 was an oversized pit structure. Structure 2 contained several burned beams and charcoal-filled sediment, with more than 100 beams found. A thick layer of adobe from the roof of the structure was also found. Five Finger Ridge, located in Utah, is one of the largest Fremont sites. 81 structures were excavated there. 7 structures had clear evidence of structural burning. 5 were pit houses, 1 a secondary pit structure, and 1 a storage structure. Only 1 burned structure was cleaned out prior to abandonment. Structure 45 was well preserved because of structural burning. Structure 45 contained a 20 to 40 centimeter layer of almost complete charcoal on its floor. The north and west walls were fired hard, but the east and south walls had been burned but not hardened. Wood beams were found in the thick charcoal layer. Structure 45 appeared to have been burned during or shortly after its abandonment. At Five Finger Ridge, 4 pit houses were found with human remains. Only 2 of the structures had evidence of burning, Structure 20 and 33. Structure 33 was only partially burned, while Structure 20 was heavily burned. The walls of Structure 33 were well preserved due to the structure burning. The structure was burned after abandonment. The burial included 2 adults and 1 juvenile. The majority of the skeletal remains were underneath the roof fall, which means that the human remains were placed in the structure before it burned down. Archaeological excavations were conducted at sites along the Dolores River in southwest Colorado. 44 structures were excavated, which date from 860 to 900 AD. These structures are related to Pueblo villages along the river. 22 burned pit structures were excavated. All the structures that contained human remains were unburned. 5 pit structures had unburned roofs and had been intentionally collapsed to bury individuals. All but one of the cases was a multiple burial. A thick layer of roofing material was collapsed, sealing in the individuals buried inside the structure. To find a possible reason why Fremont peoples purposely burned down structures, I read historic accounts about Navajo, Apache, Ute, and Shoshone death practices. The Navajo, Apache, Ute, and Shoshone believe that the deceased can return as ghosts to cause harm. Because of this, they fear the dead. They do certain practices in order to ensure a ghost does not return. Navajo practiced several types of human burials. One type was hogan burial. A hogan is the traditional house of the Navajo. The Navajo would sometimes dig a pit inside the hogan and place the body in the pit. Other times, they would just leave the body lying on the floor in the hogan without burying the body. If it seemed death was approaching for an individual, he would be abandoned and left to die. Or he would be washed and dressed in new clothes and then left to die in the hogan. The Navajo sometimes would take a sick person to an unused structure or even to one that was built specifically for dying. If the corpse had been left in the structure, it may have been partially or totally dismantled, the materials being utilized to help cover the body or grave. If the structure was left standing, whether the corpse had been removed for burial elsewhere or not, the entry was blocked. Usually this was accomplished with upright logs. If the actual burial was elsewhere, an opening in the north wall would be present. Occasionally the hogan may have also been burned following removal of the corpse. The Navajo believe if an individual dies at an old age, it meant that he lived a good life. If an individual died by a violent act, suicide, or sudden illness, a ghost could return to cause harm to the family of the deceased. Navajo believe that ghosts may return to harm and punish anyone who offended or angered them. Ghosts are viewed as bad winds that remain after an individual dies. The ghost travels as a whirlwind and enters the living, damaging their life-giving inner winds. The deceased's home and property is destroyed to protect the living from the ghost. The ghost may remain near their former home. This is why the living avoid the deceased's home. Apache practiced a few different types of burials. Burial in rock crevices was practiced, and the most common form of burial was internment. Teepee burial was sometimes practiced, but only as a temporary burial. Upon the return of the funeral party, any remaining property of the deceased was destroyed. Most of the possessions which were combustible were burned. Even the ordinary teepee was destroyed. Burying the dead was done quickly to lessen the possibility that the ghost would linger. Destruction of the dead person's property was done to forget him. Fear of the deceased was lessened when it was a child or an old person. It was believed that if a person had lived to an old age, that they had lived a full life and would not need to come back after death. The most feared ghosts were those of people who died as adults. The Apache do not speak the name of the deceased because this may cause the ghost to return. The deceased property is destroyed to forget him. Thinking and dreaming about the deceased may cause the ghost to return. After someone died, the Utes burned the deceased's possessions, and his horse was sometimes killed near the grave. They also have a fear of the dead and do not speak the name of the deceased. The Utes believe the soul lingered near the body for a few days after death. Utes took precautions to ensure the ghost of the deceased did not return. They burned the house where death occurred and burned personal property of the deceased, including horses and dogs. The Shoshone believe that the soul remained near the body after death. The body was wrapped in a blanket and taken to a cemetery where they scattered pine nuts and seeds for the ghost. The deceased's belongings were burned at the grave. Horses and dogs were killed for the ghost. A woman would burn up the whole lodge in which her husband had died with everything pertaining to it. A mourning husband also burned up the lodge. If an individual died in the house, the Hogan the Shoshone would sometimes abandon the dead body and throw the remains of the wiki up on top. There is an account of a man who had to abandon his home at Income, Idaho. My interpreter had just deserted a comfortable log cabin to live in a tent on account of his uncle's death. In order to avoid this necessity, a hopelessly sick person was sometimes removed to a solitary wickiup at some distance from the general camping ground. 1,000 years ago, the Fremont occupied the Great Basin, while the Anasazi occupied the Southwest. When Spanish explorers arrived in the Southwest and Great Basin, they found Navajo, Apache, Ute, and Shoshone living in the same areas as the Fremont and Anasazi had lived. If these Native Americans moved into the area while the Fremont and Anasazi were still in the area, they may have traded, intermarried, or exchanged knowledge with them. The Fremont and Navajo, Apache, and Shoshone all buried their dead in houses, which were also sometimes burned. At sites excavated along the Dolores River, roof structures were intentionally collapsed to seal the burials inside the pit structure. Navajo and Shoshone also sometimes intentionally collapsed the structure to seal in the deceased. Each group discussed here burned down residential structures. Navajo, Apache, Ute, and Shoshone burned down their houses because of a death ritual. It is unclear if the Fremont burned down their residential structures for the same purpose. The reasons are unknown, but these groups share a common practice of burning down houses.
The largest known Fremont pit structure was recently uncovered at Wolf Village. Daniel King argued that this structure, designated Structure 2, was a ritual structure. One criterion he used for identifying ritual structure is the filling in and burial of the structure after its destruction. King references examples from the Southwest and says, prominent among the ritual activities discussed is the ceremonial closing of a structure, which involves burying the destroyed building so as to make the site unusable. Structure 2 was immediately buried in such a fashion. The purpose of my research is to evaluate King's argument that Structure 2 was ceremonially buried. My analysis supports King's argument that Structure 2 was ceremonially buried after its destruction. Many ceremonies are difficult or impossible to establish archaeologically, as without written records, only material items deposited in the archaeological record can be used. One way to establish that Structure 2 was ceremonially buried is to identify where the material used to bury Structure 2 originated. Stratum 4 is the stratigraphic layer above the burned roof of Structure 2. Stratum 6 is the stratigraphic layer associated with the floor and use of the structure. If material from Stratum 4 is similar material from Stratum 6, then it is likely that material from Stratum 4 came from the use of Structure 2. This would mean refuse or material from Structure 2 was used to bury the structure. If Stratum 4 contained material artifacts from Structure 2, then I expect differences between Stratum 4 and strata from other structures. Stratum 4 does match other strata, then it may indicate the material in Stratum 4 was produced in areas other than Structure 2. To compare strata, I will use the frequency of artifacts in a category to the excavation volumes of the strata. I will also compare percentages of all artifacts by category for each stratigraphic unit. The Fremont occupied much of what is now the state of Utah from 8400 to 1300. They adopted farming similar to many southwestern cultures, but also relied on hunting and gathering. BYU has completed 5 seasons of excavation in Wolf Village. The most notable discovery is Structure 2, the largest Fremont pit structure discovered to date. Structure 2 was destroyed by fire, and it is likely this was done intentionally, as argued by Lauren Davis and is referenced by Crystal. The site is located south of Utah Valley at the mouth of Goshen Canyon. 9 structures have been fully or partially excavated. Structure 2 was identified as a communal pit structure and has a total floor area of 76 square meters. The average Fremont pit structure has a floor area of 22 square meters. Structure 2 has 6 main strata. Stratum 4 is interpreted as a midden layer, indicated by the blue, during excavation due to its high concentration of artifacts. This is the layer that would have been created by the ceremonial burial of the structure and had a distinctive dark color. Stratum 6, yellow, is the roof fall layer, and numerous burned beams were found in it. This layer includes the floor of the structure. Structure 6 was identified as a residential structure. There is evidence of ritual activity associated with the structure, including intentional burning, as discussed by Charles Wilson. It has a floor area of 21 square meters. It is an adobe walled structure and was built near the top of a ridge. Structure 6 has the first documented occurrence of a ventilation shaft in a Fremont above-ground adobe structure, normally just associated with pit structures. Structure 6 has 3 strata. Stratum 2 comprises most of the fill of the Structure 6, including the roof. Stratum 3 includes the floor of Structure 6. Structure 8 was identified as a residential pit structure. Its total area is approximately 35 square meters. As you can see, the structure was not fully excavated. It's located about 30 meters north of Structure 2, and there were 2 habitation services with hearths associated with the structure. Several strata were identified for Structure 8. Strata 3 and 5 are the primary fill layers, and Strata 4 and 6 include the floors of the structure. Artifacts were assigned a category and counted during initial excavation and lab analysis. I primarily use this initial classification, although the analysis of marine shell beads and some other beads involves data from Mariana Castro and Alan Jones, and some gaming pieces were analyzed by Brady Robbins. Some categories were not included in analysis, such as miscellaneous stones and other categories that could not be compared across the structures. 8 categories have similar numbers of artifacts to excavation volume for Stratum 4 and Stratum 6. Groundstone, figurines, and particularly worked bones have the largest differences. I have separated ceramics, faunal bone, and lithic debitage, which is the leftover material from stone tool production, when calculating artifact percentages. These 3 categories comprise 98% of all artifacts found in these 2 strata, and they distort the smaller numbers of artifacts. Ceramics, faunal bone, and lithic debitage percentages are all very similar, the top 3. Only worked bones show a large difference between Stratum 4 and Stratum 6. But these differences, groundstone and projectile points have the next highest differences, but these differences are smaller than some of the differences between artifacts per cubic meter of excavation volume. Structure 6 resembles Structure 2 more than it resembles Structure 8, but unlike Structure 2, the floor and the fill area, Stratum 2 and Stratum 3, have significant differences. It's also, Structure 6 was located about 150 meters north of Structure 2, which makes it unlikely that the material found in this structure was moved to Structure 2. Structure 8 has few patterns in common with Structures 2 or 6 and shows considerable variability between strata. The lack of similarities between strata from Structures 2 and 8 indicate material from Structure 8 was not deposited on Structure 2. Of all the strata, only Stratum 2 of Structure 6 here closely resembles Strata 4 and 6 of Structure 2, although Strata 4 and 6 more closely resemble each other than they do Stratum 2 of Structure 6. Structure 8 is located much closer to Structure 2, but it doesn't have any strata that resemble what was found in Structure 2, the Stratum 4 and Stratum 6. Some artifacts hold greater value or may indicate communal activity. 2 of the most valuable artifacts found at Wolf Village are turquoise and marine shell beads. Gaming pieces may or may not have been valuable. Some gaming pieces were decorated and some were plain, but gaming pieces are more indicative of communal activity as they were used for gambling. Most shell beads from Wolf Village were found in Structure 2, but Structures 2 and 6 have nearly identical proportions of shell beads. Most marine shell beads in Fremont sites are olive vela and come from the California coast or the Gulf of California. They're believed to have been highly valued by the Fremont, and only 2 Fremont sites have more marine shell beads than these structures. Most turquoise was obtained from Nevada or from the same source as the Chacoan and Hohokam peoples in the southwest. Previous to the excavation of Wolf Village, turquoise was only found in 14 Fremont sites. Brady Robbins analyzed gaming pieces at Wolf Village and placed the total number at 280. All his analysis was completed prior to the last year of excavation. Wolf Village contains the highest number of gaming pieces outside of the Parowan Valley. And gaming pieces may be the most distinguishing artifact in Structure 2. 232 were found in Stratum 4, according to Robbins' analysis, but it's not clear how many were found associated with the floor of the structure. The high number of gaming pieces in Structure 2 is probably representative of the communal nature of the structure, but shell beads in turquoise show different patterns. The equal proportions of shell beads in Structure 2 and 6 and the larger numbers of turquoise in Structure 6 may represent individual ownership of these items, but shell beads and turquoise do not appear to indicate anything about the ceremonial or communal nature of structure 2. In conclusion, strata 4 and 6 of structure 2 clearly show a close resemblance to each other and are much more closely related than any other strata from structure 2 or from structures 6 and 8. This resemblance indicates the material found in stratum 4, which covers the burned roof of structure 2, is related to stratum 6, which includes the floor of the structure. It is probable artifacts in stratum 4 were associated with the use of structure 2, and the refuse or discarded material from the structure was then used to bury the structure after its intentional burning. The communal nature of structure 2 and the effort it would have taken the inhabitants to bury the structure using baskets or other means available to them indicate this was a ceremonial event. The reason for the ceremony cannot be established archaeologically. The comparisons to the southwest suggest it may have been to prevent anyone from rebuilding structure 2 or reusing the area. Thank you.
Okay, I would also like to begin by saying that the opportunity to read these 4 papers was a pleasure. I learned a lot of new things. I served a Laotian speaking mission and worked with Hmong people, so it was fun to read about the Hmong. Ironically, the paper on Guernsey was the one with I was the least familiar, since I've done a little archaeology myself, so it's kind of ironic. It's the one that's the most English. But I enjoyed reading all of them. Like Professor Madsen, I tried to look for a overall theme between these papers, and I think that in some regard, the collectivist versus individual tension is illustrated in each of the papers, though to a lesser and greater extent. And let me describe how I see that basically as a way of moving through the 4 papers. I have to stop moving my legs. Rachel, I enjoyed your paper on the Guernsey, the island of Guernsey, and the place that the island's political process has used to define or essentially make the neoliberal market work in a specific space for them. Certainly, Guernsey seems to have a sense of place. It reminds me of Mackinac Island at the north end of Michigan, which is sort of thought of as this sort of, it's a little island. They don't let cars there, and yeah, anyhow. But there certainly is a tension in Guernsey between the individual needs of any given person on the housing market and the collective needs of the island to maintain an appropriate workforce and protect against the unique character or sense of place that they all, or especially the natives and the people who have been there for a long time, seem to share. And so in this case, this paradox of trying to balance these two forces, the need for the workforce that will work there in jobs that the locals would rather have other people do. Sounds like America. And the sense of continuing that sense of place is or at least their solution for creating this sort of way of allocating the market, different spaces, 1,700 houses in the neoliberal versus the 40,000? No. 25,000, yes, houses that are in a more regulated workspace. So it certainly seems to be this attempt to negotiate between the collective needs of the island and the individual needs of the people living on the island and the people working there. And I was also struck reading the account of particularly, her name was not Maddie, but Jackie, Jackie and Andy, So Jackie's moved through 5 different housing license, and the interviews of other people ironically show how, in the immediate sense, they seem to interpret their difficulties from an individualist perspective, while at the same time begrudgingly admitting that there is a collective good there in the regulation. But the very fact that they begin with one point sort of seems to sense that the neoliberalist mindset sort of is in the frontal experience, in their frontal lobe is what I want to say, but in their experience more directly, and it's an easier way for them to think about things. And the reflective act on the collective things requires acknowledgement of something as opposed to the primary individual needs. So, Mary, you talked the most directly about the shades of collectivism and reasons why several different women decided to stay in their polygynous marriages, and advocating for transcending the individual and collective dichotomy when trying to treat marriage therapy. I think it's interesting that the interviews you conducted in North Thailand already sort of affected a population that's adjusting its way into perhaps a more individualist society, or at least the socioeconomic conditions had changed. And with the visitor, at least I think this was in your paper, not in your presentation maybe, but individuals visiting from America talking about the different way in which Hmong people are practicing this interface between decisions of staying in a marriage or not staying in a marriage affected, or at least were being affected by new socioeconomic conditions. All that to say that if we were going to dig down to the original concern about whether we're transcending collective and individualist, perhaps we'd want to venture further into a Chinese village or something like that, in that the individual situations of the village in northern Thailand and Hmong villages in America, or Hmong communities, they're not villages, right? Communities in America might already be transforming through a series of things that would necessitate the advocation of transcending the collective individuals, but exploring further would be exciting to see. It would be exciting to see you explore further whether or not Hmong who remain further more deeply entrenched in the mountains, there aren't that many left, are there?
Depends on the country, but yeah, there are.
But in Laos, maybe. Yeah. Venturing further there and seeing if the balance between collectivist and individual is similar outside of the socioeconomic conditions which are novel for the people that you interviewed. But whether or not that can be done is a different question, but that would be an interesting further exploration. Crystal, your investigation of burnt houses and the choices, or the perhaps policies is a better word, in terms of large groups, as to whether or not how burials represented, or how we can interpret Fremont burnt houses as distinct from communal buildings, right? So here's the communitive or the collectivist versus the individual sort of tension. In terms of interpretation in this case. I thought that was a really interesting study, gathering historical and ethnographic sources from more recent tribes, and then projecting that backwards into the larger sample of burnt houses from the Dolores River and the Fremont and the Navajo. One of my thoughts there that I thought would enhance your further study on the on this thing is to further explore the Dolores River phenomenon here, where we find multiple persons buried in the same pit house, and it leads me to wonder if multiple people were dying at the same time, or if a father dies, they kill his. Or if a husband dies, they're killing his wife along with it. The sex of each of the skeletons left over, or something like that, seems to, or at least that multiple individuals are being buried in the same household. It seems that something special is going on there. Special is maybe not the right word for it, but something different is going on there, and that doesn't invalidate your hypothesis, but it offers an area where you could do some more exploration and perhaps elucidate or articulate the relationship between that practice as a local variation on this avoidance of interaction with the dead. On first reading, I thought perhaps these were violent deaths, and they just threw them in especially the ones in the doorway. You throw it in the door and then burn it over the top if there's multiple people. Not something I want to think about, but this multiple person in a single burial seems to be an opportunity to explore a variation on simply burying one person in a house if they die in the house, and if we have to burn it, as opposed to the options of taking them to temporary structures. Now, Robert, I enjoyed your paper. Reminds me of my days. I dug at a site in Turkey in grad school, and counting lots of sherds at the end of the day. Fond memories of wondering why I was still alive. So I thought that your paper was interesting. You're attempting to either validate or invalidate a previous theory that there was a ritual destruction at the structure 2, which is much larger. So it ought to, or in this case, it's a different structure. We want to know more about the particular configuration of the structure, and its destruction might give us a clue to it. I thought that your choice to analyze the density of artifacts in the levels as a quantitative way to try to validate whether or not these two levels from the same part was an interesting approach, and I liked it. Based on the evidence you gathered, I would probably agree with you, but I'd want one thing that I think would be interesting is if you could differentiate between different areas in the structure and their densities as opposed to the entire layer. That is, my understanding is you had samples from a square meter here and here and here, and perhaps or separating those square meters out to find relative concentrations of certain things might give you a better indicator of the actual act of destruction at the end of the day. Those are my thoughts on the paper. I really enjoyed them. Like Professor Madsen, I think you've all done a good job at consolidating a lot of learning that's taken place in your program. And I have a couple questions afterwards, but I'll save those for the thing because it's 12. I'll save those for our question and answer period, which I assume starts now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to be making a little noise over here. Set the food, but let's have a sort of general Q&A. I don't know if any of the panelists want to respond to either discussant, or if you have any questions for the panel. So sort of open it up for that.
Excuse me, 15 minutes too late.
Yep. Sorry about that. Done.
I have a question with respect to the burials and utilizing historical and ethnographic information about certain burials. I haven't read the paper, so all I can see is what's presented here, and I hope you all realize that the papers are longer than the presentation, so there's more information in there. My question is, how frequent are these kinds of burials in the context that you're talking about, for example, among the Anasazi and so forth, relative to the overwhelming majority of burials from those particular cultures? I realize that there aren't large bodies of Fremont burials, but there are large bodies of Anasazi burials, enormously large bodies. How frequent are these kind of burned structures with burials?
They don't seem very frequent. I only looked at a few sites. I would need to look at a lot more sites. The Fremont, I don't think, have a lot of burials that they found in structures. I don't know if there's any others besides the Five Finger Ridge, and I haven't studied too many other sites from the Anasazi, but it seems like they're not very common, and like burn structures aren't very common. And for like the Five Finger Ridge, out of I think it was 37 pit houses, there was only I think 7 that were actually burned, so it's a small amount. And there were 2 burials that weren't burned at Five Finger Ridge, and the structures weren't burned.
And my other question is, What is the basis of assuming that the burning was done by the people who were performing the burial or that sort of thing, and was not the result of fire breaking out or somebody else doing it after the site was abandoned?
Well, it's hard to see if they were if it was intentionally burned by the people who actually lived there, or if someone came in and burned this. But from experiments that they've done on earthen-covered structures, they've seen that it takes a lot to burn down a structure, that it can take several hours just to burn down the roof. And so if anyone wanted to burn down the structure, it would have to be, they would have to have a lot of fuel, a lot of, a lot of stuff added to ignite the pit house, especially because it's earthen covered, so not a lot of oxygen can get in there. And one of the papers I read mentioned something about how they could possibly have dismantled some of the roof in order to provide more oxygen inside to have it burn better and quicker.
I might add, in the not the Hinkley Mounds, but the Provo Mounds area, B described, they excavated a pit house that had been burned, and they had all kinds of burned logs and stuff in there. And they have information on that in the MPC, so you might want to take a look at it, just as something to compare to.
Well, can I throw something up there? So two of you brought up the Upaichani versus Pagarachu, and you both talk about the etymology of Pagarachu being rooted in Spanish and therefore problematic, but I'm wondering about, and maybe I missed this because I've actually read multiple drafts of both your papers, but the Upaichani, what is the etymology of Upaichani? Is that it's an upland, like a Sierra Quichua word? I mean, do people actually talk about because I mean, on the one hand, they value Upaichani because it's supposedly a sort of bastardized term, right? Like it's a pure Quichua term, but what is the etymology? Do people talk about the etymology of it? I mean, because the Tina Quichua talk about it as not being a word that's familiar to them, but are they concerned with the particular etymology of that term, similar to the way that the Unificado proponents are particularly concerned with Pagarachu being based in Spanish and therefore unpure?
Well, I hope this answers your question. It seemed that there was this idea of Highland and it's different, and so I guess I'm not familiar if Upaichani is actually a Highland word or if it's just a neologism, I guess, that was created by the board who created Unificado. But I think the Taina Quichua speaking people see it as different, and a lot of times they projected the idea of Highlands onto things that they saw as different. Does that make sense? So
you're not sure about the actual etymology of it, but they imagine it to be a Highland word.
Yeah.
Because basically they say Unificado is fine for all those Highland people, but Amazonian and Quichua were different, basically.
Basically, and like I remember talking to one woman, and I said some term that was kind of unfamiliar to her, and she was like, "Oh, that must be Sierra Quichua," because she wasn't familiar with the term. So it's like, yeah.
No, same thing. I mean, it's definitely, as far as I know, a Highland, or at least viewed as a Highland term.
Because it'd be interesting then to look at the etymology of the term and compare that to the language ideology version of, we're going to project that onto the Highlands, and then look at the actual etymology of the term. Similarly to a way that, because on the other side of the coin, the Unificado proponents are saying, well, Pagarachu is not an impure term. And we can point to the actual etymological root in Spanish, right? So it'd be interesting, and that's reflective of their language ideology. It'd be interesting to do the inverse of that and compare the actual etymology of Upaichani compared to the language ideology view of it, which I think would elucidate that a little bit more. Your thoughts, comments?
Comment on Robert Bischoff. Bishop's paper, no matter what kind of analysis you do, you should never exclude positive. Just kidding.
Now, why would you say something like that?